Dylan from the Smart Economy podcast. We are at day one of Permissionless III, joined by Jullian Duran, the product lead at Mara, not Marathon Digital.
Not Marathon Digital.
How are you doing today, Jullian?
I'm doing very well. Happy to be here at Permissionless.
Yeah, so I kind of want to kick off into all these conversations, just giving a little bit of context for who you are and why you're here. So maybe you could just give us a little bit of your genesis story about how you ended up in the blockchain and crypto space.
Well, that's a good question. So I started off founding an NGO in Latin America, worked a little bit of time in US politics, briefly delved into edtech, worked in China in a fintech company, and somewhere along all of that I found that financial inclusion is perhaps one of the most important things you can do for society. I mean, I know technology well, and I'm obviously currently wearing a business hat, but I think that fundamentally the world doesn't become a better place if we don't try to make it so.
Totally.
And I think with blockchain, I came across, actually I started in the Ethereum world. I came across smart contracts, and to me what really captivated me was the idea of a multi-sig, which sounds like the most basic thing ever and people would laugh at it. But think about the concept of a multi-sig is you can own financial assets together with other people, immutably, cryptographically. It's a primitive, right? It's a financial primitive that doesn't exist in the banking system. Mm-hmm. And so that basically untethered 4 years of exploration into the space, and now I'm in the Bitcoin world trying to promote that innovation and using the Bitcoin blockchain, using this global decentralized ledger to, again, promote financial inclusion in as many places as possible.
So would you say that working on Bitcoin led you to Mara, or would you say that Mara led you to working in Bitcoin?
Ooh, definitely Mara led me to working on Bitcoin.
Mara, excuse me.
Mara, I mean, they have a big vision to try to innovate and create new types of revenue streams to try to move forward the digital economy and promote Bitcoin adoption. And for me coming in, my scope was, all right, I'm here to build new types of applications on blockchain. Mm-hmm. And then I discovered how unique Bitcoin is as a blockchain, right? Everything from the mythical status of the founder to how decentralized and communicative and collaborative the ecosystem is. It's been a process of discovery and a great one.
How long have you been with Mara?
A year and a half.
A year and a half. So in that time, there's kind of been this renaissance of Bitcoin L2s. And how has that kind of changed your ability to be a product lead at Mara? Has everything kind of been revisioned from the ground up? Because prior to BitVM and opcode, there was basically side chains.
Right.
And so what has the kind of evolution or maybe even the revolution been with Bitcoin L2s from your perspective?
Well, it's been abrupt, I would say, because when I first started at this job, the whole goal was to build a sidechain ecosystem and to promote layer 2 adoption on Bitcoin. I talked to the who's who of venture capitalists, the who's who of builders across the Bitcoin ecosystem, and frankly, I was laughed at. In most cases, I was told that I was wasting my time because Bitcoin had all the infrastructure it needed. And then at some point, late last year, poof, out come 70 L2s, and now it's kind of a foregone conclusion that Bitcoin needs a layer 2 network. My view on it and where the state of the industry is right now, I don't think it's yet time to give up the idea of sidechains because opcode releases and upgrades require consensus level changes.
Yes.
And if there's something about Bitcoin that people don't appreciate enough is the community is very conservative and rightfully so. Mm-hmm. And so what you have right now is a situation where all these different layer 2s are pitching this new and innovative tech that they're building on BitVM, that they're building new types of rollups. But the reality is the only production level technology that's ready for enterprise grade use cases today on Bitcoin layer 2s are sidechains. Mm-hmm. And that's why we decided to double click in that theme, in that realm. Now, we're actively exploring these other upgrades and we'd love for them to reach production ready status. But the top priority I have for my team is we're building tech that's useful. We're not building tech that's theoretical.
Yeah, and I want to delve into Enduro in a second, but maybe I'm taking 2 steps forward to take 1 step back. Let's just explain what Mara is for somebody who's never even heard about it from our community. So
sure.
Marathon Digital recently rebranded to Mara, and the kind of understanding I had was that this is just a large-scale mining operation based in the US. There's obviously more to it than that. So maybe from your perspective, you could give us the high-level 30-second elevator pitch.
Yeah, I would say Marathon at a high level is trying to promote the digital economy. We're securing energy grids. We are finding ways to productize new types of hardware that come into the Bitcoin mining process and using them to scale to the worlds of AI and data centers. We have obviously layer 2 technology. We're a full stack technology company in my view, and I think where you're going to see Marathon heading is being a centerpiece of the Bitcoin economy, but also being a centerpiece of the broader digital economy.
So what's really interesting about Marathon is that, if I recall correctly, you're not only just working in Bitcoin, but like you also mentioned working with data, with electricity grids. Yeah. So like a lot of folks who are based in the US might recognize that Bitcoin miners in like ERCOT in Texas have had a nice relationship where during periods of overloaded power, then the Bitcoin miners shut down, and during periods of underused power, maybe the Bitcoin miners consume that. What is your relationship with like local energy providers? And if that's not your realm, we can totally jump to another area.
Not totally my realm, but I'll just leave it at, we have a flexible load. And so at the end of the day, Bitcoin miners are additive to the energy grid, and yeah, plenty of people on our team that are out speaking on that and pretty cool work that we're doing across the US to showcase the value of Bitcoin miners and local energy grids beyond just being a consumer, but actually a provider.
Mm-hmm. And so when you look at like the blockchain and Web3 space, you have like a lot of shadowy supercoders who are here, and Marathon or Mara is a publicly traded company in the US. What are some of the opportunities and constraints that being a publicly traded company offers you to build in the Bitcoin ecosystem?
That's a great question. I think, frankly, it's mainly opportunity. And I'm a bit of a contrarian in that, because when you have a lot of, taking Permissionless as an example, or like the different startups and DeFi companies that are coming out, the reality is you can't create something in the financial realm, and frankly, most of blockchain right now is in the financial realm. You can't do something in the financial realm that is explicitly anti-government, explicitly anti-regulators. Mm-hmm. At some point, you're going to run afoul, and at some point, you might end up in either, as I like to say, irrelevance or jail. So truly, I think having the constraints of a publicly traded company, knowing that compliance has to come first, that we have to be honest and above board about our dealings and the sort of businesses we build, I think actually makes us more resilient as a business longer term, as opposed to going down rabbit holes of products that don't really have an end state, or products that, again, could end up being sort of destructive, I would say, to not only Mara, I'm saying generally to blockchain. Yeah. You have a lot of high-profile examples of DeFi apps that have come out, that have tried to innovate, that have done so not being so scrupulous, when not being so principled, and then that just ends up damaging the rest of us, right? High-profile crypto exchanges being top among them.
Yes.
And so for me, when I'm building in Web3 and what I'm doing in Bitcoin, knowing that I have my compliance team support and knowing that we have to operate within the bounds of a certain legal framework is actually in many ways liberating, right? Because it means that there are paths that I know we just can't go down, and there are others that we can send at full steam.
Yeah, I mean, the past 2 Thanksgivings I've been home, my aunts and uncles have just been rubbing that large-scale exchange in my face, and it's hard to say, well, here are like good actors, and Mara provides like a nice opportunity to counterbalance that. I'm curious, now that we have Bitcoin as a commodity network, it has ETF support in the US. It arguably is a decentralized network that can't be shut down by any state across the world. Maybe Ethereum has also reached this status. So now that we have kind of Bitcoin and Ethereum in an equal state-resistant, kind of also state-accepted status, are you guys also exploring building in the Ethereum ecosystem, or are you just doubling down on Bitcoin?
Doubling down on Bitcoin, and there's a big reason for that, and it's the brand. I think when it comes to the digital, the infrastructural resilience, the decentralization of nodes, just by numbers, Bitcoin is still much higher, but okay, let's admit that maybe it's comparable. I think the big thing is, any sort of digital currency, it's not going to take steam if everyday people don't recognize its value and don't respect its worth. And the reality is, you go to most parts of the world, I live in Dubai and I spend a lot of time traveling throughout Asia and Latin America, most everyday people still are not familiar with Sol, with ETH, with any of these other tokens, but they know what Bitcoin is.
Right.
And so for me, as somebody who's trying to innovate in fintech, somebody who's trying to build in the forefronts of tokenization and trying to go and onboard mainstream users, it's so much easier for me to pitch them on a Bitcoin solution rather than an ETH one. And I actually have a story of that. 3 years ago, I started a savings app out in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan. We were going out and doing user interviews, and the number one question I kept getting, the app was simple. We were just kind of building a DeFi platform on top of Aave, sort of skidding it and making it more user-friendly. But the biggest feedback I'd get from users is, well, where's the Bitcoin in all of this? And I used to get annoyed because I'd say, well, there is no Aave on Bitcoin. What are you saying? But that's the average day user, right? The everyday user recognizes brands, they recognize Bitcoin, they don't recognize this other stuff. And so that's why I think for mainstream apps, it needs to be Bitcoin.
Yeah, I love that, because if you hear today, maybe like the killer use case for crypto in general is like stablecoins, and kind of like the loud narrative right now is people use Tether on Tron because it's cheap and fast. Right. But in other parts of the world where maybe they don't even have issues with hyperinflation of their local currency, maybe they do trust a Bitcoin more than maybe a Tether on some fast, cheap network.
I'll give you another example. A few months ago, I was in London London chatting with some exchanges from Africa, and we were talking about a payment app that we're conceiving of, we're like in the early stages of building. And when I'm chatting with these guys, hey, so how's USDT activity? Like, where we're trying to think about different stablecoins to probably bring on our layer 2 networks. The guy stopped me in my tracks and said, hey, look, USDT activity is super high. We have a lot of volume, but the other 50% of it is just vanilla Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's literally just commodities traders and entities across parts of Central Africa that are trading in Bitcoin, that are sending payments in Bitcoin. And again, it kind of comes back to where are you getting data from, right? And I think it's so easy to look at, top publications and just think, oh, well, USDC is king, or USDT on Tron is king, and nobody would use Bitcoin as a payment mechanism. But when you go into communities globally and you actually see who's organically using crypto, again, it's all about the name brands, right?
Yeah.
Why is the dollar the dominant currency? Is it because people have this extensive socio-political understanding of the US hegemony? No, it's because people just know what America is. They know the, red, white, and blue. They know the bald eagle. It's a very simple brand recognition, and only really Bitcoin has that.
And so a third of the world is unbanked, and do you think that Bitcoin is the solution that will bring that third into a modern global economy?
I think it could, but I think the ecosystem needs to evolve a lot more.
Got it.
I think a lot of people think, oh, well, there needs to be more infrastructure, there needs to be more layer 2s. I don't actually think that. I think what Bitcoin needs is more interfaces. It needs more applications, more connection to those audiences. Because the unbanked, sure, they might have cell phones, they might have DirecTV in their houses, but they're not connected to this, elite tech mainstream. And so we need to find a way to distill and rather, let's say, translate these principles, these heady principles of decentralization to everyday people. And I think right now that's missing, which is what I'm trying to change.
So you guys are also building a sidechain now, Enduro, yes. And I know you just said that L2s aren't what's necessary to increase Bitcoin adoption, but maybe Mara has different relationships with like institutions, financial institutions, enterprise entities. So maybe let's just talk a little bit about the launch of Enduro in February and kind of like what the vision is and why you guys built it out.
Yeah, to clarify, I'm not saying we don't need any layer 2s. We just don't need more layer 2s.
Yeah.
There are hundreds of them already. I think we're at a state where there's enough infrastructure to do interesting things with, and I don't think enough people are doing interesting things with that infrastructure.
Got it.
Now, coming back to our infrastructure, to Enduro specifically, this multi-sidechain ecosystem, one of the defining principles of it is we wanted to build a layer 2 that followed the Bitcoin ethos. And that may sound, super obvious, but it's not, because almost every single other layer 2 that I've seen come out, and the ones that have existed for a while, do not follow core tenets of the Bitcoin ethos. The principle among them is, if you're creating a new chain, why do you need to create a new security token at the heart of that chain? Mm-hmm. So, builders and other layer 2s will tell me, well, Jullian, how do you incentivize builders? Well, you incentivize builders by providing them features, right? You build genuine products that allow people to access new audiences. But the job of a chain is not to just create a new speculative bubble. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest things we did with Enduro was every single sidechain we're creating has a Bitcoin peg native asset at the heart of it. The second bit is, if the layer 2 does not depend on proof of work, then, newsflash, it's probably not that Bitcoin related. So us as miners, one of our biggest incentives of supporting Enduro is incremental transaction fee revenue. Enduro becomes a vibrant layer 2 network where you have tokenization, payments, loyalty, all of this stuff happening. Now Mara makes obviously more money per block. But in the world of other layer 2s, and most of other layer 2s that have come out, they don't incorporate mining at all. They don't incorporate proof of work, and they're basically just creating these alternative systems, these parallel tracks that, I'm not trying to say those layer 2s are not useful. I'm sure they have their own set of use cases, but they're not Bitcoin, and they're not a Bitcoin layer 2. And I think there's a lot of, let's say, stretching of the truth, to put it mildly, about what it means to be a Bitcoin layer 2.
Totally. And so Enduro is leveraging merge mining.
Yes.
And my high-level understanding of merge mining is that essentially a block is confirmed on Enduro, or at least like it's added to the state of the record, once it's also been added to Bitcoin state. So Mara is earning a new revenue stream.
Yes.
So maybe you could just share a little bit more about how mining happens on Enduro and how it relates to Bitcoin. And then maybe also kind of like talk about how this separates itself from BitVM, which isn't necessarily live right now, and maybe also opcodes, which might need like some political grandstanding to get approved.
So look, I would say merge mining, what it basically means is you have a machine and you're mining Bitcoin, you can simply, by a simple API integration, by simply appending data to the blocks you're sending to the blockchain, you can now mine multiple chains at once without using extra energy. And that's actually really important, because when we first thought of Enduro, we didn't want to create a situation where miners are becoming even bigger and needing to plug in more machines, because then there's an opportunity cost to mining these other networks. And so merge mining, it's an efficient process. It was actually invented, or rather first talked about by Satoshi himself. So well-worn territory, that part's pretty straightforward. Now, how that relates to opcodes and BitVM and all of that, what I'm talking about right here is the consensus layer. So how do blocks get added to the blockchain? I'm not talking about what's in those blocks or what sort of state exists on the nodes or how big those nodes are. I'm simply talking about how do you translate compute to, or rather, how do you translate energy to compute, and how does that compute develop this ledger of Bitcoin? If we're talking about the compute itself, in other words, the state, in other words, what's going in these blocks, that's where you have different sort of virtual machines, where you have the question of BitVM, where you have the question of opcodes, and that's, in many ways, I see a different domain.
Got it.
So I would say step one is let's create a network of layer 2s that actually support Bitcoin main chain, support proof of work. That's step one. And I think most people in this industry would agree with me on that. It's just most teams that are building don't want to spend the resources to actually figure out what I think is actually one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. The next step is, okay, well, now I have this layer 2 network. What do I do with it? What can people do? What sort of smart contracts can they write? And that's, I think, where you get into a little bit of a tense debate of, well, should smart contract programmability be available on the main chain? Should it just be available to side chains? In the case of BitVM, you have a potential bridging protocol. All of these are different innovations to, in other words, empower Bitcoin to have a grander set of functionalities, a grander set of programmability. My personal opinion is, the Bitcoin main chain, let's keep it as is, and let's first demonstrate a use case for these new types of programmability. Because frankly, I think the jury is still out as to whether smart contracts have mainstream appeal. Truly. I think there's still a lot more apps that we can build. I think stablecoins are in their infancy, but there's a lot more room to grow. So before we go about changing $1 trillion network that has mainly been ossified for the past decade, or rather, with a few minor changes, has relatively remained the same, let's first prove these use cases in the mainstream, demonstrate there's actually evidence behind them, and then go about thinking what that could mean for the main chain. If you ask me though, I think frankly, the main chain's probably going to ossify, it's probably going to stay as is, and you're going to end up having these network of layer 2s that are going to serve different use cases. Ticketing, payments, culture, art, whatever you call it.
Right. And so does Marathon have to, or Mara, excuse me, does it earn revenue fees from Enduro if the block is mined by Marathon that all the Enduro transactions occur? Or are other miners also able to kind of earn a revenue off of Enduro?
The goal is to create a permissionless proof of work system where miners can plug in and earn revenue streams. Now, we're of course right now still in testnet with Enduro, so there's a lot of implementation details that need to be sorted. But the goal is that any miner can plug in, any miner can earn fees, and you would not be only earning fees from the Bitcoin network, you could earn it from all of these Enduro sidechains at once.
And so that's the beauty of Enduro, is it's not necessarily a separate sidechain, it's kind of like a platform to launch sidechains on top of.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Okay.
Yeah. We've been experimenting with multi-sidechain network, platform for sidechains. It's an ecosystem, and we're just trying to prove that layer 2 and Bitcoin means something and needs to happen.
And so, kind of like zooming out, you guys are testing your first real-world use case with an RWA on Avant. So maybe you can share a little bit about what Avant is, and then also talk about the RWA with the Whiskey Barrel platform.
For sure. Yeah, so Enduro being an ecosystem, we really wanted to see new types of applications being built on it. And one of the top applications, one of the top use cases that we thought would be compelling for Bitcoin Layer 2 would be real-world asset tokens. Reason being that right now the Bitcoin Layer 2 ecosystem is just token crazed, right? Everyone's talking restaking and yields and earn yield on your Bitcoin. But frankly, most of those offers, if they're not fraudulent, they're misleading because Bitcoin is a fixed supply asset. You cannot be offering yield on it in the longer term. However, if the Bitcoin, or rather if the tokens on some Bitcoin ledger are linked to a real-world asset, and that real-world asset is a business earning yield, now you have a sustainable form of yield that I think Bitcoiners are going to trust. And so for me, one of the defining principles for real-world asset tokenization on Bitcoin is create a real-world security or real-world asset-backed security that is actually going to seem credible to the Bitcoin audience. And I think the potential is just tremendous because you have, $1 trillion network. Bitcoin DeFi pales in a percentage basis comparison to Ethereum, and everyone's wondering how do you unlock that percent? It's like a $300 billion, $400 billion DeFi opportunity.
Right.
I think it happens when you provide Bitcoiners, the most paranoid, skeptical people on this planet, yield that they can actually trust. And so where Avant came from was a thought of, let's find an asset, or rather let's find an asset class in a liquid industry that uniquely needs to be tokenized. And this is actually a really important point because there's a lot of RWAs out there with treasury bills and money market funds. The reality is I can invest in a treasury bill. I don't need tokenization to provide that for me. In many ways, tokenization is a bit of a novelty. However, when it comes to something like American whiskey or something like equipment manufacturers or mineral mines or whatever you call it, some liquid industry, if they're not tokenized, they're probably not going to access capital markets. And so for us, it was let's uniquely solve a problem for a massive industry. Let's pilot it. Let's show that there's actually investor interest. Let's show that it's technically feasible, which at this point we have. And now the question is, all right, where do we go from here? Because the goal of Avant isn't just to be a whiskey tokenization platform, it's to be a marketplace for different RWAs, backed by the security of Bitcoin, but having that enterprise-grade infrastructure, that resilience, that dynamism that you would expect out of a security token offering.
And so has the first real-world use case within RWA on Avant, has that kind of like opened the door for future conversations?
Of course, yeah. We have millions and millions of other issuance opportunities now that frankly are stressing me out a little bit. But look, coming back to our earlier point about compliance and sort of operating within a Web3 company, or rather operating within a public company, we really want to take this at a cautious pace, right? We want to be sure that every single security token that could be listed is not running afoul of any regulator obligations, and we want to be sure that the system, that the investors, the issuers, are knowledgeable and understand what it means to tokenize on the blockchain. We're ultimately a tech provider, right? Our goal is not to go in and become the issuer or become necessarily the investor. It's to create that marketplace for these two parties to interact. And so we really want to be careful about how that happens. We don't want it to grow into this monster of tokenizing things that should not be tokenized or should not have any capital raised for it. And so we're being careful. But yeah, so far so good. I mean, we presented it yesterday and dozens of people are already interested in tokenizing and investing and getting involved, so that's good.
Hey, RWAs on Bitcoin is hitting a lot of notes right now that are kind of like at the forefront of the broader Bitcoin, blockchain, crypto, Web3 space. So you're going to kind of have an interesting perspective on this, as Mara is a publicly traded company and you're also living abroad right now, so you're living from the outside looking in. But how do the impact on US regulations and the regulatory ambiguity we're facing right now, how does that impact your day-to-day and maybe even Mara's concern with its ability to provide all the offerings that it's seeking to?
So one of the first things when we thought RWA tokenization, we knew that we would have to have some transfer agent, somebody with a regulatory connection to the SEC that could confidently go out and market, or rather manage the ledger behind these security tokens. And so we ended up working with Vertalo, which is a team that has I really feel like their experience in RWAs is without comparison. And they're basically the transfer agent behind this first whiskey tokenization pilot, behind this first issuance itself. Now, going forward, we'll likely continue to work with people who have the licenses, the necessary licenses to provide these sort of issuances and the secondary trading associated with it. But we're not moving into any direction without having all of the licenses and the regulations completely cleared up. It takes longer. Look, Avant first came up as an idea maybe earlier part of this year. The partnerships were all locked in by the spring, but it just took 2 quarters to really get the legal opinions in order and have very clear what our role in the entire marketplace would be.
Right. So last question, zooming out, I just got back from Token 2049 in Singapore, and the vibe there is a lot different than here in the US. What are your takeaways from Permissionless III here in Salt Lake City? And maybe what are the differences between the vibes that you're feeling in the Middle East, maybe even in Southeast Asia, versus what's happening with conferences here?
It's a great question. I think in the US, you're seeing a lot more enterprise, institutional sort of interest, adoption. You have a lot more, let's say, formal teams, a lot of VC-backed teams. There's a little bit more of a headiness to how to approach DeFi. And I think within the US, there's no question that, ecosystems beyond Bitcoin are dominating a lot of the airwaves, and people kind of are very excited and think that that's kind of the future. What I see in the Middle East and also in Southeast Asia and really across the rest of the world is very, very greenfield space. And you see a lot more, I would say, organically driven, maybe scrappier teams out there trying to innovate the world of payments, of tokenization, et cetera. And I think the reason is the true use case for crypto, for blockchains, for permissionless chains of any kind, is in places where financial systems are not as resilient. Because the reality is, like, look, I work at Mara, I earn a paycheck in fiat. Okay, sure, if they wanted to transition it to Bitcoin, that would be a conversation, but I'm content earning my paycheck in fiat. That isn't the case for 99% of workers across the world. And so in places where earning fiat, holding fiat is not as compelling, of course you're going to have a surge of crypto entrepreneurship. Now, I don't think one is better or worse. I think there's actually a much larger scale of innovation possible in the emerging world. But I think you just end up with Permissionless being basically a conference for a lot of these enterprises to think about how blockchain can incorporate into their operations, B2B companies coming out, going to market. But in Asia, you just see these just, pedal to the metal guys that they're just inspiring, right? They're out and they're trying to change their financial systems, and I think they're going to have a lot of success.
Awesome. And Jullian, if anyone's interested in building on Enduro, where can they go look to find information?
On X, we're Enduro BTC. For me, Jullian0701, and Enduro.io is our website. So please get involved, and if you're interested in a new sidechain idea and a new app idea, if you want to tokenize on Avant, all of that is open. It's greenfield, right? We're an innovation hub. We're trying to incubate a lot of different apps, and we're more than happy to have conversations with builders.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
If anyone wants to see any more of the interviews we've had here at Permissionless 3, head over to the Neo News Today YouTube channel to catch all the videos we've released.